Hello, this is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Institute of Lutheran Theology, and particularly its Christ School of Theology. If you've chanced upon this on the internet, in YouTube, you're watching a series of lectures dealing with the philosophical underpinnings of theology. So we'll be talking a bit today about Thomas Aquinas, more on the philosophical side, of course, than the theological side. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 AD at Roccasecca, Italy. And of course, he lived to 1274. And Roccasecca is a town halfway between Rome and Naples. Thomas encountered the new learning, what was called of Aristotle, while he was studying in Naples. And he studied under the great Albertus Magnus, which of course is just Latin for Albert the Great, right? And this guy, by all accounts, was a tremendous mind, Albert the Great. He entered the newly formed Dominican order, and of course Thomistic theology has forever been associated with the Dominican order because of this. He taught at Paris, and then he went back to Italy to teach. And so there's a little thumbnail sketch of Thomas's life and teaching, I guess. That's very, very brief. Thomas believed that philosophy is a public discourse. And he believed that using the standards of rationality of philosophy, one could know certain truths, right? The objects of knowledge, of philosophy, are known through themselves. The Latin is per se, so one could have per se knowledge of many of the items comprising the universe. Theology and philosophy both use the same formal thinking. Logical deduction is not different in one over and against another. Semantics are basically the same, with some, of course, differences having to do with analogical predication in theology. But they have different grounds because, of course, theology has a source of knowledge that philosophy does not have. And, of course, that is revelation, right? So Thomas believes you can prove that God exists. And, of course, God has certain kinds of properties. One can do that philosophically. But one can never know the Trinity, the Trinitarian nature of God, nor the incarnation, nor any of the salvific is a word having to do with salvation, right? One could not know salvific truths apart from revelation. Indeed, the philosophical sciences have a different rationes cognoscibiles, a different rational knowledge than does theology because they have different grounds. Philosophical knowledge begins with knowledge of the world. That's easy enough, right? You start with the world and you learn and you reflect. You have deep knowledge of the world, beginning with the experience of the world. Theological knowledge, however, begins with what God has revealed about himself in creation and redemption. Philosophically, Thomas Aquinas is an Aristotelian, though he was heavily influenced by Neoplatonism as well. In fact, we can see Aquinas as this great synthesizer, bringing together the Aristotelian tradition and the Neoplatonic Christian tradition. Now, of course, we've talked about these things now in this course for a very long time. But when you think of Neoplatonism, the word to think about is participate, right? And this goes back to Plato himself. Every particular horse participates in the form of hoarseness, right? Well, from a Neoplatonic perspective, starting with the one, if you remember how this works, I think you do. The one emanates out of itself into nous, remember? And then there's an emanation out of that into world soul. And then there's an emanation out of that into the world, right? And this is kind of how this operates. The emanationalist model, you should know those words. Somebody talks about an emanationalist model. You should be connecting up to Neoplatonism. And of course, the big name here is a guy by the name of Plotinus. And from a Neoplatonic perspective, of course, the world is an overflow from world soul, which is an overflow from nous, which is an overflow from one. And so if you're using this kind of way of thinking about God and God's creation, obviously from a Neoplatonic perspective, beings participate, right, in some way in God. Right? But from an Aristotelian perspective, of course, you don't have participation as a fundamental ontological category. From the Aristotelian perspective, what's very important is the collapse, of course, from potentiality into actuality of any particular thing. So you have potentiality here, right? And you have actuality. Some of you might remember studying about potential and kinetic energy in high school. You have a collapse from a potentiality into actuality, but some other actual thing has to bring about the collapse of something that is potentially hot into being actually hot. So from an Aristotelian perspective, movement always has to do with a efficient causal notion which brings about a collapse from a potentiality of a thing into its actuality. From an Aristotelian perspective, God is the actus purus, the pure act, actus purus, which actualizes finally all potentiality. Okay? So God is, from the Neoplatonic perspective, that in which all things participate, but from an Aristotelian perspective, it is the actus purus, without any potentiality within it. It brings about the collapse of all things from potentiality into actuality through these chains, these causal chains. Now, of course, what Aquinas works with is the notion of esse, which is to be. That's the infinitive, to be in Latin. So esse for Aquinas is the purity of form in itself. And it is this, esse, pure being, which causes movement from potentiality into actuality. So is a very important notion for Aquinas. Is the unity of all multiplicity. Is the form by which many things are one thing. Wherever we use the word is, we're talking about being. And of course, for our good friend Thomas Aquinas, the truth of reality measures human beings. We are measured by the truth of reality. Truth is seen as something out there. And the truth of God then measures reality. Okay? So God's truth measures the external reality, and that external reality measures human being. In his very famous work that we went through line by line once in graduate school, De Veritate, truth is present for our good friend Aquinas both in the act of understanding and in the reflective act upon the act of understanding. And of course, in a lot of textbook editions when Thomism was really big, It certainly didn't thematize the second aspect as much as somebody like, shall we say, Karl Rahner did, right? The Transcendental Thomists really were all over this notion of the reflective act upon the act of understanding. Aquinas believes there's knowledge of the external world. We know things external to us. We naturally know them. Aristotle thought so. Thomas thought so. Any reflection on the intellect shows that it is characteristic, if you will, of the intellect to express that reality that is other than itself. That is what the intellect does. Okay? Thomas does not find himself in the Cartesian solipsistic predicament trying to build a bridge to the external world. You start in the external world. For Aquinas, we insatiably search for truth, and we have a primary drive to do so. So human being is the drive to know and the drive to do the good. That is how we are constituted. It is part of the order of creation, if you will. While we know many truths through reason, as I've said before, revelation is needed to communicate certain teachings. And these teachings that revelation communicates, while not entailed by reason, are certainly compatible with it. Okay, so this is where we are on this short lecture on Thomas Aquinas. We'll be right back and we'll talk more about Aquinas. Thank you very much.